So I think part of the effectiveness of the lesson last time was note-taking. So if you have paper, you want to take it out. If you don't, got some right here. And if you don't have a pen, you can share. I don't have any of those. You can share with the person next to you. We're not going to go too fast, but there is really one part of this lesson that I feel will be the part of the lesson that I think note-taking will benefit the most. I'm a visual learner, and this lesson came about after Sajjan's lesson about the lineage of man and the lineage of the snake, or of the serpent. And as Sajjan was going through the lesson, again, I think in visual terms, I think a lot of people do that. We're visual learners. We're visual primarily. And for me, I was just thinking, how would I go about learning more about this? And for me, it came down to, I need to make a visual. And so it kind of stems from the idea of a lineage and the idea of a family tree. And how we're going to kind of make the family tree. Now, who was here last time for it? You're going to regret raising your hand. I gave you kind of like a challenge last time. There was a concrete assessment at the end of the lesson last time. Just heard someone say, "Oh snap!" If you were here last time, I challenge you, and I also challenge the people next to them who weren't here, not to judge them, but can you, if you were here last time, draw the lineage from Adam to Joseph? If you can't, that's absolutely fine. But this is one of the assessments last time. Based on your faces, I can see is there going to be an assessment this time too? And the answer is yes, there will be. If you were here last time, we did it together. And so similar to the way we did it. I'm going to explain a little bit more as they're doing that, because this is going to be a bit repetitive for them. It all comes down to this. We ended our Bema series on Genesis, and this is the question that I felt we should be able to answer or have a response to. We looked at Genesis in a very different way this time. We looked at it through Eastern eyes, through visual learning, through trying to see the story instead of the facts, to put aside our knowledge base, what we want knowledge-wise, and to trust the story. We started off with kind of the East-West thinking, but if someone were to come to you and ask you this question, how would you answer it? If someone were to say, Genesis is just fairy tales, it's myths, it's legends, you can't prove it. How are you going to prove the historicity of some of the people that are mentioned in there, the places that are mentioned in there? Yeah, it mentions the Tigris and Euphrates and Mesopotamia. We got that in 6th grade. But all the other stuff, like what do we do with all that other stuff? It just seems like stories made up. And are you really going to base your faith on something that's made up that you can't prove? I think that's a legitimate question. I really do. Because we live in an incredibly knowledge-based society where you Google something and you can get answers. I don't know if they're always the right answers, but you can learn something very quickly. My middle school students, this is their go-to. They've got a question, and we've got Chromebooks, and they can look it up in 5 seconds. And so this is just where we are. And so if someone wanted to know, how do you think about this? What would be your answer to Genesis now, or to this question after learning about Genesis in a different way? So that's kind of the basis of this. And then just as a quick review, we did this when we started the East-West thinking. If we were to think about the timeline of Genesis, we start with Adam, and then we've got about 2,000 years to Abraham. So Noah's somewhere in between there. Then we've got his son Isaac. So if you're still making your lineage family tree, you can cheat a little bit here. Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And then that's where Genesis ends, and we go to Exodus, and then there's the enslavement in Egypt for a couple hundred years, and then we have Moses. Now, all scholars point to Moses as being the one who wrote Genesis. There's some debate about it, but we'll go with Moses. How is Moses going to tell the story of all of this time to a people who just came out of slavery? Remember, they spent 7 days a week making bricks. This was their life. It wasn't studying. Now, they might have known some of the stories, but a lot of their understanding of the world is influenced by the Egyptian culture and the cultures surrounding it. That's why we see similarities between the stories of the Bible and other Near East ancient cultures. And so Moses has a task. He's got to figure out, how does he what stories does he tell? And how does he remind that these enslaved people who are just coming out of Egypt after hundreds of years, generations, that they're God's people? And how does he tell them their story? How does he tell them their story? That's the task. Because when we first started this, I said, if I were to write the origin story of my faith, it would look different. I would want more facts. I would want more dates. I would want more specifics if I were to write it. But I also come from a Western culture where I like bullet points and 5-paragraph essays. I don't come from a culture that tells stories. You know, if I were to go back and just to see, if I were to ask you, how would you explain eternity? When we first started this, I gave a picture image. Does anyone remember the picture image I gave? If you were to define eternity? Does anyone remember it? It had to do with an insect. I said, Pat, what did you say, Pat?
An ant going around the earth.
Yeah, so if I were to ask my dad, hey, Dad, what's eternity? He'd probably pull out a dictionary and say, this is eternity. If you ask someone from the Near East or in this culture, or even today in Eastern cultures, they might tell you a story, and they say something like, you know, imagine the earth is made of steel, solid steel all the way through, and then an ant starts walking around the equator. The time it takes for that ant to wear it down, to split that earth in two, that's eternity. And now you're thinking, well, the earth's big and an ant is small. How much friction can that ant actually... And now I'm thinking like a Westerner, right? It's like, no, just know it's a long time. Like, that's what eternity is. And so these are the types of stories that we find in other cultures and go here. Got to hurry up. So some of the questions from the Genesis narrative. Think about some of the questions the Israelites would have after being freed. You know, they might have, why were we enslaved? Like, why did this even start? Where did we come from? You know, we're mixing. We've been mixing with other Semitic cultures for a long time now. How did we get here? And then, what just happened? Did I just walk through the sea? Did I just see these plagues? Like, who is this God who just got us out of bondage? And so these are some questions I would ask. I think I'd have some, Moses, what just happened? And these were people just like us, so I think they'd have some similar questions. This also follows up on what Rondi spoke about a few weeks ago when we were in our Bama situation, the qualities of the beast. There are a couple of themes that we see throughout Genesis, and if you've been here for the Bama, we understand that there's two big themes: knowing when to say enough is enough, to trust the story, and to master the beast, to kind of find a way to control this sin, this beast crouching at our door. So when we talk about the beast, this is going to be a big part of it, because this is where Sajin started and ended with his lineage sermon. If you didn't hear it, you should go back. I'm not sure how it's titled, but it's in there. And then Rondi came across just a little earlier with this idea that a beast has certain qualities. A beast, and we're not talking about like just any animal, not like your little puppy dog at home. I wouldn't consider that a beast. It's an animal, but it's not a beast. Beasts, though, are those animals we think of in the wild. And beasts act on their desires. They have no self-control. They want to eat, they'll eat, and they'll kill anything to eat it. They're animals in the wild who will eat their newborns. They're young, right? So they act on their desires right away. They prioritize self over others. Some of them might have packs, but if another pack, same breed, same animal comes, they're going to prioritize themselves, number one, and then their kin next. But they prioritize self over others. And then finally, violence and power are a first resort, not a last resort. Not a last resort. Is we're told to, as humans, we're saying, violence should be the last resort, if a resort at all. But this is the first resort of the beast. So with some of those ideas in mind, we're going to go to Genesis 3. You can turn there, but this is where you want to have your paper out. If you have your paper, you want to turn it long ways. So it's long ways like this, okay, up and down. If we were going to fold it hot dog style, but we're just going to keep it up and down. Portrait, that's the word. And we're going to tell some stories here. Now, Tim Mackey, Bible scholar, Bible Project guy, he talks about Genesis being like the 30,000-foot view. It's you're in an airplane and you're flying over the story. You're flying over the history of Israel, and then the stories that are chosen to be put into Genesis by Moses are kind of like a camera zooming in on certain people and certain events. Obviously, this isn't the entire story of the Israelite people. There are probably a lot of other stories that are out there, but these are the ones that Moses thought were most important for who? For the Israelites who just came out of slavery. Okay, so that's kind of the context. This is an ancient document. We need to understand the context of it. So with your paper going portrait, you want to kind of measure 2/3 over. So if this were my paper up here, portrait, you might want to come over 2/3 and draw a line, something like that. Now, I'm going to show the animations up here this time because this board, you're not going to be able to see it back there. So you're going to see something similar up here on the screen. This is just to start. On one side, I want you to write lineage of Eve. On the 2/3 side, you'll write lineage of Eve. And on the 1/3 side, you write lineage of the beast. Now, essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making a family tree. I had a subscription to Ancestry.com, right, a few years ago, and it was awesome. It was really cool to kind of trace back my family history, and this is kind of a little bit like that. So if you have this, I won't go too fast because I'm not writing it at the same time. But Adam and Eve, this is where it begins. The line between them just shows that they're married. So you guys have seen family trees before. You have an idea. Now, Adam and Eve had how many kids? So we know of 3. So you might want to draw one line coming down the middle. We're not going to go as slow throughout the whole family tree, but this is just to practice family treeing. Then out of that line, you want to draw another kind of longer line, looks something like this. Then 3 lines going down. Don't be a perfectionist here. No one's grading you on their quality of your artwork, except your friends next to you. So we know the children. Now there were many more, but these are the ones that we're gonna stick with here. We have Abel, we have Cain, and we have Seth. Yeah, I heard it. Seth. You're like, Seth? He's not in the story. He is in the story. He totally is. So, who continues the lineage? Is it Abel, is it Cain, or is it Seth? It's got to be Seth. Now, the squiggly line represents a bunch of generations. I'm not going to go through all of them because we don't have paper long enough. Squiggly line is many generations. Then we get to our next character. It's Noah. So we go Seth, squiggly line, Noah. The next kind of zoom in type of big story. Noah's got a couple kids. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, if we're talking about the fathers of the faith, who continues the line here? Is it Shem, Ham, or Japheth? It's Shem. Yeah, we get the name Semitic. You might have heard of the term anti-Semitic, unfortunately. But the name Semitic, and Semitic just refers to the people groups of that region of the world, in that area of the Middle East. So Semitic, so another squiggly line, because there's a bunch of, actually 8 generations here. Squiggly line. Then we get to Abram, but we'll just go with Abraham. How are your squiggly lines? Abraham, again, has many kids, but we'll just stick with 2. Abraham has Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael would become, many people believe, the father of the Arab nations. He's the first son of Abraham. Isaac is the promised son. And then from Isaac, we go directly to Jacob and Esau. Who continues the line? Jacob. Who does Jacob have? Joseph and Joe's bros, because there's too many. From Joseph, this is where Genesis ends. So these are the fathers of the faith, you call them, throughout the book of Genesis, and it ends with Joseph dying in Egypt. And so when Joseph dies and his brothers die, that generation dies, they are in Egypt at this point, and there's a new king that comes to Egypt. And if you read the first couple sentences of Exodus, that new king doesn't like Joseph's people. He doesn't like the Israelites. And really not the Israelites at this point. But he doesn't like the Israelites because they're multiplying too fast. Remember, God's blessed them to become as numerous as the sands on the ocean, or sands on the shore. And they're multiplying. And they're going to outnumber the Egyptians. And so that's when they're enslaved. Okay, so that's how the Israelites get there. Because we'll go into Joseph's story a little bit in later. But this is it. So for those of the guys who were here a couple weeks ago, nice job if you got that right. So this is the lineage. This is the lineage. I wanted to do something else. Do we have time? Got like 5 extra minutes. Okay. This might blow your mind a little bit, which is good. We go from Shem to Abraham here. Do you guys see this? Can you guys turn to Genesis 11? So in Genesis 11, we get the lineage from Shem to Abram. There's 8 generations in between. A little bit of a leading question here, but do you think you have Shem, 8 generations, and then Abram? Is there any way that Shem and Abram could have lived at the same time? 8 generations. Let's find out. Okay. So what I want you to do is turn your paper over to the back side. Turn your paper over to the back side. And I want you to write the name Shem up there in that corner. Lee's going to help me out, and he's going to give me some numbers, and we're going to do some math. Now, I teach civics, so math is not my thing, but I know we have a math teacher in here somewhere. Hi, Lisa. But we can all add, I think. Okay, so Lee's gonna read. He's gonna read parts of Genesis 11, and I'm gonna write some numbers up on the board. But the first number we're gonna start with is Shem. Shem was 100 years old. So Shem is the son of Noah, and he's 100 years old when he has his first child. So we're gonna write 100 right here. Lee, can you read that part?
Here we go. So this is the account of Shem's family line. We're in verse 10 of chapter 11. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad, and after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters.
So stop right there. If Shem was 100 when he had his first kid, and he dies 500 years later, how old is Shem when he dies? So just keep that number in mind. 600. He's 600 years old when he dies. But now we're going to see, is there any way possible that Abraham and Shem could have actually lived at the same time, 8 generations later? So Lee, can you continue? He's going to read kind of an abbreviated version of the next couple verses.
All right, verse 12. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father. We're going to jump down to verse 14. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became a father. We're going to drop down another verse. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became a father. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he became a father. When Reu had lived 32 years, he became a father. When Serug had lived 30 years, he became a father. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he became a father. And then verse 26, after Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
Okay. So those are the 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you add these numbers together, did anyone do it? 290. Nice job. 290 years. Now, from Shem, 8 generations, it's 290 years. How long did Shem live? Well, he lived another 500 years after he fathered his first child. Now, just stay with me here for a second. We find out later in Scripture that Abraham lived 175 years. He was 175 years old. So if we add 175 to 290, we're going to get 465. Is 465 less than 500? Not only were they alive at the same time, but who outlived Abraham? Shem. Shem outlived Abraham. Now, what's the significance of this? Shem was one of the only survivors to live before the flood. He was Noah's son. He was one of the sons on the boat. He was able to see what life was like before the flood. This is pretty amazing. When we talk about historical accounts, eyewitnesses before DNA testing and videos and things like this, eyewitnesses were the way to prove innocent or guilt. When we talk about it in the court of law. Here, not only, and there's speculation, I'm speculating a little bit here, because we don't know if Abraham actually ever met Shem. But the possibility is there, and rabbinic texts actually say that it did happen. There's possibility that Abraham met his great-great-great-great-whatever grandfather, Shem, and was able to ask him what was life before the flood. This just gives us more validity to the stories that are mentioned. It's not just Moses thinking about what it was like, but, Moses is only a few generations removed from Abraham. And Abraham, being 8 generations removed from Shem, we were like, no way could they be alive. This kind of also answers one of the questions I had growing up, asking my dad, how come they live so long? And I don't know if this is the exact answer, but it kind of hints that way. God wanted to make sure the story continued and that we could trust the story in a way, right? So it was this kind of eyewitness account. I read this on a blog in like an obscure comment section, because that's what you do. And I was like, no way. No way. So I got out my math pad, and I was like, I'll do this. And it works. Not only this, but there's actually about 30 years where Noah and Abraham overlap living. So I was like, wow, that's crazy. That's crazy. This book's crazy. It's crazy. All right. Let's get back to our thing up here, though. That was extra. I didn't do that last time. Okay, so back to it. Now the lineage of the beast. So we learned from Sajin when he gave his sermon that the lineage of men would be other men and women. They were going to populate the world, the lineage of Eve. The lineage of the beast is different. The beast of the garden was not a snake, so it's not like snake babies. We're not talking about like baby snakes, as Tim Mackey puts it. That's not what the lineage of the beast is. The lineage of the beast is a spiritual beast. The beast that talked to Eve was walking, talking, and reasoning. That's not a snake that I know. But it does sound like a spiritual being that like I should be afraid of. He said that that lineage would also continue in Genesis in 3, starting in verse 14, that will also continue. And so there's some power to think there. And so what I want to show is Genesis is not only about knowing when to say enough, but how to master the beast. And so on the side where it says the lineage of the beast, we're going to go back to those 3 qualities of the beast. 3 qualities of the beast. I'm going to put them on this side just so you can see them. Lacks self-control, prioritizes self, and violence, power is a first resort. So if you have a different color pen, or if you want to switch colors with the person next to you, you can do that, because what we're going to do is show how the lineage of the beast interferes with the lineage of Eve throughout the book of Genesis. And so what I want you to do is start with a squiggly line, because we're talking about serpents here, so we're going to squiggle. And the first person that this beast interferes with in the story is, I want you to draw a squiggly line and almost like have a serpent wrapped around Cain. We learned that Cain, he didn't master the beast. He didn't know when to say enough is enough. Instead, which of the 3 did he do? Remember, he killed his brother. Why? What was it? Violence and power as a first resort. He was a beast. He lacks up. You can actually say all 3, right? You could say all 3 for him. And the snake wrapped him up. The snake wrapped him up. Now, this is a story that, again, Moses is choosing to include in the story he's telling to the Egyptians who came out of slavery. The beast was right there from the beginning. Right there from the beginning. So, if we keep going, we're going to spend a little time on this story. How the snake wraps up Noah, and how the snake wraps up Ham. If you guys could, turn to Genesis 9. Genesis 9 is a very, not obscure, I won't say obscure, but it's something that I was like, whoa, this is the part after the flood when everything is supposed to be nice and rosy again. They just endured the destruction of the world, and they come out of the ark, and it's supposed to be like, this is awesome. But one of the strangest stories, for me personally, happens right after they get out of the ark, or soon after. Before we get to that story in Genesis 9:1, there's something that God asks of Noah and his sons. He said, "Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth.'" Remember that. Remember that part. He says, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." It's one of the first things he says to Noah and his sons as they come out. Now what I want you to do is go down to verse 18. And I'm going to read, just kind of follow along. This is where the strange passage comes in. It says, "The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan." So from here on, Canaan is going to be introduced. This is Ham's son. And we know Canaan as an adversary of the Israelites throughout their history. So just remember that. Now, we're not talking just about Ham, but he's referred to as Ham, the father of Canaan. "These were the 3 sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered all over the earth. Noah was a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan," because that's not how he's referred to, "saw his father's nakedness and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders, and they walked in backward and covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, 'Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers.'" And my question always was, well, first, this is a weird story, but what did he do to his dad? What did he do to his dad? And it's pretty intense. And so this comes from the Bema series, and this teacher, Marty Solomon, who studied at the feet of this rabbi named Rabbi Foreman. And there is a text, an ancient Jewish text called the Midrash. I'll just spell it out so you can look it up later. Midrash, M-I-D-R-A-S-H. And this was like a 2nd century AD commentary on the Jewish text. So we have New Testament commentaries. If you ever have to give a lesson, you probably have a Bible and a commentary. It's a scholar's interpretation of what the Bible's saying. They had the same thing, the Jewish texts. And in one of the Midrashes, it's a commentary, but it's a style of commentary. They point to a very important phrase in verse 22, where it says, "Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his brothers outside." Now, in most translation, it says something like he saw his nakedness. But really, the translation should be something like he looked upon his father's nakedness. And to us, we're like, what's the difference? He saw, he looked upon. It just seems inappropriate at worst. However, the Midrash teaches that this was actually an idiomatic expression. There was a literal meaning and a figurative meaning. Kind of like in idioms in English. If I say to throw in the towel, what do I mean? Give up. If English is not your first language, you're like, towel? What towel? Right? So it's an idiomatic expression. We really need to understand the culture to understand what it's saying. This is a little bit shocking, but what this means is to look upon someone's nakedness doesn't mean just to see it, but then to act on it. And so what the Midrash teaches was that Ham actually either molested his father, Noah, or castrated his father, Noah. And that's incredibly different than the story of Noah I read in my children's Bibles growing up. Incredibly different. But it brings about some clarity to the part where it says, "When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, then he curses his youngest son's descendants to be slaves of the other." Like, he just looked at them. Why would he curse them to be slaves? It's like, well, there's something else there. And most rabbis will actually lean not towards molesting, but actually castration, where Noah cannot have more kids. And remember what God's command was to him: be fruitful and multiply. So Noah, in his revenge, is wrapped up by the beast, and he curses his son. This kind of curse is only reserved for God. Like, people do not give this curse to others. But Noah took it upon himself, and you guys can choose which quality you want to apply there, and acted upon revenge. And throughout history now, Canaan is going to not only sometimes be the slaves of Israel, but an adversary to Israel. Israel will stumble and take upon the Canaanites' gods and make them the gods of their own gods. They'll intermingle when God says don't. And so there's a lot of strife and heartache that comes from this one moment of revenge that Noah does, I guess you could say, on his son Ham. Now, obviously, Ham, he also was wrapped up by the beast, too, for what he did to his father. He was trying to, maybe he wanted to be the one who was going to have all the kids. And he didn't want his father's next sons to be more powerful than he was. And so you have this self before others, right? They didn't trust the story. Ham didn't trust the story. Noah didn't trust the story, which is kind of a theme of the Bema idea. So we have the beast wrapping them up. Squiggle, 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 squiggle. And we really could wrap the serpent around every name on here, but just time doesn't allow. So you want to squiggle down, and you get to Jacob and Esau. Now, this is another very interesting story that Moses includes. It's not one I would have included. I don't know. It doesn't. But again, this is the lineage to Jesus here. And we can see that this lineage has some bumps in it. So we know Jacob and Esau, if you're not sure, they're the children of Isaac. Esau and Jacob are twins. Esau comes out first, and he is like an animal from the beginning. He's hairy. He comes out, and he actually looks like an animal. As he grows up, he becomes a man of the wilderness. He's a hunter. He's a gatherer. He's his father's favorite. Jacob is more local, stays closer to home, tends the fields, and the Bible says he was his mother's favorite. So there's favoritism going on here. There's a point in the story where Esau comes home famished from hunting, and Jacob is there preparing food. And what Jacob says, he's like, hey, I will give you food, Esau, if you give me your birthright, which is his value, his inheritance in a way. And what does Esau say? I'm going to die anyway. I'm so hungry. Give me it. He devalues it, right? He's prioritizing himself over really what is going to come. He's not trusting the story. Later on, when Isaac is old and he's ready to give over the inheritance, Jacob tricks his father and also tricks Esau with the help of his mom. If you remember, Jacob dresses like Esau. He goes and puts on a skin, an animal skin, to be hairier than he is. And he goes in there, and because Isaac can't really see all that well, he tricks his father, and the birthright is given to Jacob, the second son. This was incredibly important, incredibly important. And again, the story's not being trusted. One of the things throughout the book of Genesis we see is people trying to act like God when God is there with them the whole time. But they want to be God. You see, the Tower of Babel is another good example of this. It wasn't necessarily that they could do great things. God gave them the ability to do great things. It was their desire to be just like God, where God had to stop it. Then we get to Joe's bros. Joseph's brothers, jealous of him. And Joseph, he was kind of a little bit of a show-off, showing off his coat. But at the same time, it shouldn't have led to them trying to kill their younger brother. They knew that he was Jacob's favorite. And Joseph, though, turns it around, right? So his brothers are wrapped up by the beast, violence, they lack self-control, all three in a way. Joseph does great things, though. While he's in Egypt, he moves up the ranks, very admirable. And that's eventually how his family, through famine, comes to be in Egypt, and they're given a place of privilege, but then over time, they lose that as the new king comes in, as I mentioned before, and then we get into Exodus and the rest of the story. This visual, though, I think is important. I think it's important for a few reasons, because as we read the Bible sometimes, even with those numbers we read, when we did the math here, I skip over those all the time. I skip over the lineages. I can't pronounce the names, the numbers. I can't do math in my head like that. Why would I need to? But for people who are coming out of enslavement, they have questions. They want to know. They want to know, how can they trust this story? Well, you can trust it because although it's 8 generations, you can kind of go back to the source. Now, I'm not saying he did, but I'm just saying it's possible. And there are other people who are living long, long times. You can go back to them and ask, what was it like? What happened? Wouldn't it be great if we could do that with our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents? How cool would that be? So that is the image that I think hopefully is helpful. So what does this all mean as we come in for a landing here? How does the Genesis narrative answer the questions of those Israelites freed from slavery? Well, I think it does a couple of things. I think first off, it highlights the lives of those who didn't master the beast and who didn't know when to say enough is enough. It highlights them. It's almost like hey, you just came out of slavery, learn from the mistakes of your forefathers, but at the same time, know that God can teach through those things and that God's still with them. Abraham wasn't perfect, but he was given the promise, right? There's covenants made with imperfect people. David was not a perfect person. He was a murderer, but he was David, right? He was King David. A lot of good. Is a reminder that God values you, not because of what you can do, not how many bricks you can produce, as Lee mentioned early on in our series, but who you are. And then I also think, too, very important culturally, historically, this God is very different than the other gods of the cultures around them, the Canaanite God and the Akkadian God and the Egyptian gods. So the Israelites know these stories because they're, the same way we know all the weird pop references. You're kind of like, how do I just know this? Well, you're just in this world of constant information coming into your brain. It's like, why do I know the words to those songs? In a similar way, the Israelites would know about these gods and these stories because they were just there. It's what people talked about. They were saturated with it. But this God of the Bible, even though there are other stories of floods, there are other stories of twins in other cultures, this God's different. And this God has a story for them and has a plan for them. Whereas in other cultures, the gods are vengeful. The gods create humans not out of dust and love, but out of chaos and corruption and evil. So one god kills another god, and the dead god they create man from. And that's how other cultures were able to explain the greed and the sin that's innate in humans. Not our God, right? Not our God. That's not our story. So this is something, we did last time, a little line of logic. If knowledge is power, and I'm sure you've heard that before, wisdom is knowledge applied, then wisdom can give us the power over the beast. We know this knowledge now, but how would we apply it to become wiser? And I think it's the wisdom that's going to, not just the knowledge of it, because you can know a lot of stuff and not do anything with it. We know a lot of smart people, or you might have friends like, that guy's really smart, but I wouldn't trust him with a butter knife, kind of thing. If you don't apply the knowledge you have, then what use is it? So the concrete assessment that I gave to the men last time is something I give to everyone here. If someone were to say those stories in Genesis, could you study this family tree we did, and could you reproduce it? It's one thing to understand it, but I often tell my students, can you produce it? Can you reproduce what we talked about in class? But more than can you apply it to a conversation or to real life? Right now I'm doing a unit on economics, and my kids are into it because economics, they think is all about money. It's more about decision making. And of course there's decision making with money, but it's about decision making when you have limited resources. And so this is kind of what we can do. How can we apply it? The abstract assessment, now that we know more about it, what can we apply in our lives? And finally, this one I added from the last time. I said, what qualities of the beast do you recognize in your own life? And how do they manifest? And so I put 3 up there. Are you a hunter? Are you a guarder? Or are you an attacker? And last time I shared something about the idea of a beast hunting. And there's a hunt. There's the searching for something. Whatever it is in this world, you search for it. You don't even necessarily go get it, but it's the searching can take you off course. God has a path, but when you start hunting, you go off the path. And you start searching. Are you a hunter? Does the beast reveal itself in you as a hunter? For me, the guarder, I think, is one of the big things. People use beasts to guard their property, their stuff, their most prized possessions. And I know for me, I can be a guarder. The beast within me wants to guard the things that I think are precious to myself. And those things are comfort and my time. I want to be comfortable, and I want my time for myself. And I will do things in order to protect that. I may not call a brother back who's giving me a call because it's my time. Like I just sat down. The game just got good. Whatever it is. And so I guard that. That's the beast. It's not attacking anyone. I'm not hunting. But that's the beast guarding something within me that thinks it's very valuable. But really, what's more valuable? I think we all know calling that brother back or making time for whoever it might be. Or are you an attacker? Is your first resort to something that forget the hunt, you just right there, you just go for the kill, right? It's right there. It's right in front of you. And so I think not only can we recognize in our life, but how does it manifest itself? And I think that's something to consider. I gave this resource last time. If you don't know it, it's the resource of the week. I don't know. Overviewbible.com. This is an incredible resource that I found a few years ago, and it is advertises itself as a jargon-free way to learn the Bible. Oftentimes, if you pick up, a Bible or religious websites, there's a ton of theology and language in there that is tough to get through. This person who put this together is clearly a teacher and a Christian and believes that this is the Word of God, but reveals things in it in a very straightforward way. And for me, it's been very helpful in kind of breaking through some of the theology that exists in the Bible that's hard to get, and kind of get to the facts, and then you can add on later, kind of build the foundation. So this is a helpful resource in case you might need it. With that said, that's 5 minutes over, and I'm out of slides. So thank you.